Good evening. Hello and welcome to this evening's event titled Agnes Martin, Innocence the Hard Way. My name is Sandra Sikorova. I'm the curator of public programs here, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this event in our public event series coinciding with the Agnes Martin retrospective here at Tate Modern. The aim of this diverse program of public events is to offer new perspectives and multiple ways of engaging with Agnes Martin's life and work. And we will return after the summer with a curator's tour of the exhibition in September, and also with the film screening of Mary Lance's documentary Agnes Martin with My Back to the World in October. So return for that, please. This evening, however, we have the unique opportunity to be joined by Martin's biographer, Nancy Princenthal, who will offer a more personal insight into the extraordinary life of the artist. We will learn about Martin's formative experiences, the development of her work, and the range of art communities that she lived in. Nancy will also share with us some of the challenges and merits of being a biographer faced with an artist as elusive as Agnes Martin. Nancy Princenthal is a New York-based critic and former senior editor of Art in America. She's the author of Agnes Martin, Her Art and Life, published by Thames and Hudson last month. And her writing has appeared in Art Forum, Parquet, and the New York Times, and in monographs on Hannah Wilke, Doris Salcedo, and Robert Mangold. And before I hand over to Nancy, this evening's format will be that Nancy will present for about an hour, after which you'll have a chance to ask her some questions, concluding at 8, and then you'll have a chance to purchase a copy of the book and have it signed by Nancy in the adjacent space in the staff foyer. And finally, I'd like to thank Thames and Hudson, our partners for this event, for their support in making it happen. And now please join me in welcoming Nancy Princenthal. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you, Tate Modern, for inviting me here. It's an incredible honor and a humbling one to speak about Agnes Martin in this institution. I want to say thank you also to Frances Morris and Lena Fritsch, and congratulations, and to Tiffany Bell as well, for the spectacular retrospective of Agnes Martin's work, which I had the pleasure of finally seeing this morning, much anticipated for me, and it is just a marvel of clarity and insight. I learned a great deal. I've said this before over the past month since my book was released. I wish I could start again. There's a lot that I've learned in the interim. I'd also like to thank all the folks at Thames and Hudson who helped me steer this book to completion, both in the New York office and here in London. And I'd like to thank Sandra Sikorova and Anna Murray for helping to organize this event. They've done so with great zest. So I first wrote about Agnes Martin's work a long time ago. My writing about Agnes began when I was in college. I first saw her work when I was in high school and wrote a senior thesis on Agnes Martin's work. And in order to complete that thesis, I sent her a letter asking her a number of questions, all of which had to do with the critical response to her work to date. That was the late 1970s. And she wrote back and essentially said, oh, forget all that. Forget what the critics have said. Follow your heart, seek inspiration, and you'll do just fine with your thesis. And I thought, great. What do I do with this? I'm writing an academic paper, and she tells me to follow my heart. I had asked her, I thought, fairly pointed questions about very esteemed writers who had already weighed in on Agnes Martin's work. They included Donald Judd and Lawrence Alloway and Dory Ashton. And she gave me nothing in reply to my queries. And I also felt I knew something about her work, and what I knew best about it was that it was among the most erudite and sophisticated and brainy work that I had ever seen. I found it quite challenging. Perhaps some of you have had that experience as well. But even then I knew that if it could be reduced to critical analysis, it wouldn't have the power that it does. So I had a struggle to resolve that I think is still with most of us who confront her work. In any case, I want to say that despite her injunctions, I have both continued to read responses to Martin's work as well as to consider what she meant by advising me against it. And I have found that trying to track the curatorial responses to her work has been fruitful, starting with the very first exhibitions that she was included in. Among them were the pioneering show of op art called The Responsive Eye that was organized by William Seitz at the Museum of Modern Art in 1965, Systemic Painting, organized by Lawrence Alloway at the Guggenheim in 1966. I think it's difficult for us to see Martin's work in relationship to op art now. Somebody like Bridget Riley doesn't seem to tell us very much about Agnes Martin, but indeed there were discussions around perceptually based work that took place in the mid-60s that did throw an interesting, if to our eyes perhaps rather slant light on what she was doing. The relationship to the artists who were included in systemic painting, which is close to the work that was included in a show called 10 at the Virginia Dwan Gallery, also in 1966, establish connections that continue to frame the way Martin's work was seen for the rest of her life and in fact since. And those are connections to artists who are generally called minimalists. Some of the artists who were included in that show are Carl Andre, Joe Baer, Dan Flavin, Donald Judd, Saul LeWitt, Robert Morris, Ad Reinhardt. Martin came to feel that having been included in that show was just simply a terrible mistake. The identification of her work with the work of the minimalist painters, with their spare and rather impersonal geometry, was not the way she wanted her work to be seen. She always identified instead with the work of the Abstract Expressionist generation, who were in fact her coevals. She was the same age as them, not at the same age as the minimalists. And yet, that connection, I think, helps us see, perhaps more by difference than by similarity, what she was up to and what she was up against. As recently as 2005, there have been exhibitions that continue to, and will, I'm sure, continue to reframe the way we see her. There was a 2005 exhibition at the Drawing Center in New York that presented her work in relationship to two painters who were faith healers, who used their geometric abstraction, painted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Hilma af Klint and Emma Kunz used their geometries to treat patients. It's likely that Martin would have rolled over in her grave if she knew that that was the context in which her work was being shown. And yet there is a commitment to the spiritual purposes and the spiritual possibilities of art that she shared in a tenuous but not altogether negligible way with those two painters. So despite her injunctions to me about paying no attention to critics or to those who discuss an artist's work, paying no attention to ideas, I have, in fact, continued to be interested in both curatorial and critical thought and in the ideas that they, and in fact artists as well, have about their own work. And I've also ignored her injunction to pay no attention to the internal conceptual bases that artists use as guidelines for creating their work. in fact, I became ever more curious about what the inside of Martin's experienced life was like, operating under the assumption that every form of art is an effort at communication, and it comes from the internal experiences of the person who makes it. So, Agnes Martin was born in 1912, same year as Jackson Pollock, a coincidence often noted, and John Cage as well. Both of those coincidences, I think, have some meaning in relationship to her work. She was born in Macklin, Saskatchewan, on a farm. Macklin, Saskatchewan, then as now, is a very remote part of Canada. Of course, even more remote then. In 1912, Macklin was still essentially, still really part of the 19th century in terms of the life that was lived there and its economy, which was and remains largely agricultural. Her father, her grandparents, all four of them came from Scotland onto the prairie by covered wagon. This is probably not as meaningful to a British audience as it would be to an American audience, but if any of you have read Little House on the Prairie, that's essentially the kind of life she lived. Tough and full of deprivation. There are a couple of things about the landscape and the context there that are striking for a discussion of Martin's work. The landscape is enormous and radically empty. One thing that is inescapable about the experience of being there is the size of the sky. The sky seems much bigger than the land. That's true of the American West as well. The clarity and the color of the light, the extremes of weather, not just from season to season, but in the course of a single day. The wind, which residents confirm blows more or less constantly. The dryness of the air, very striking, and why it matters is that it produces this sort of preternatural quality, so that things that are very, very far away seem small rather than distant. I think you can actually see that in some of her first landscape paintings. Martin herself talked about seeing a train crossing the horizon at 9 in the morning that was still exiting the horizon at noon. That's how far across the prairie you could see. The land has a sort of billowing. It's not dead flat, as in some parts of the American West, but a kind of billowing character. But the farming that took place there ruled it with a kind of geometry that I think is relevant as well. Wallace Stegner is a Canadian novelist who was raised near where Martin was at roughly the same time, and he describes a field of spring wheat with seed rows as precise as combings in a boy's wet hair, which I think is a lovely description of the farmed landscape there. I was there in October of this year and was struck by it was harvest time, and there was a sort of cat's pelt kind of thing going on. It had that feeling. All of these things can be associated with Martin's mature paintings, although she adamantly denied that there was any connection to the landscape or to the light that is characteristic of Saskatchewan. And indeed, all of the characteristics that I've just described in relationship to the landscape are true of New Mexico as well, which is where she would wind up spending more than half her life. You can already tell that Martin was very good at adamantly denying contextualizing features for her work. One of the big surprises to me about being up in Saskatchewan is that I took a number, tons of photographs when I was there on my little cell phone camera, and actually there was somebody with a much better camera who took pictures as well, and there's nothing to see when you look at those pictures afterwards. The landscape just disappears. It's just dead flat and big sky and nothing, which surprisingly, or perhaps not, is also true of Martin's work. It disappears, much of it. This is my way of apologizing for the positive slides I'm going to be showing you. It really does, especially the grids of the 60s disappear in a photographic reproduction. You have to be there. It's a full body experience, and you really have to be face to face with her work in order to have any sense of what it is that matters about it. I think there are some things about the logistical and physical conditions of growing up there that are also pertinent to the development of her work and especially of her character. Primary among them are the difficulties. It was a landscape that required resourcefulness, that rewarded independence, that rewarded resilience. All of those are characteristic of Martin's later life. There are other things that are strikingly like New Mexico, the lively presence of indigenous peoples, even more striking in Saskatchewan, where the Native Americans are still a very big part of cultural life there. And that's true of New Mexico as well, which has a very significant Native American population. Martin's father died in 1914 when she was 2. So the hardships that I'm talking about were largely a product not just of the difficulties of being a homesteading family, but also of growing up in a fatherless family in a time when being a woman homesteading a mile-square farm was practically unheard of. If you look at the homesteading documents of that time, there's no provision for women being heads of farms or heads of homesteads. There's a little bit of mystery about the circumstances under which her father died. There's a lot of mystery in the circumstances of much of Martin's life. He was said to have died due to injuries sustained during his service in the Boer War in South Africa. The Boer War ended in 1902. He died in 1914. So those are some long, lingering injuries. It's also said that he contracted syphilis when he was there. That would be a more plausible explanation. It's also said that he just up and left, which was not uncommon in homesteading at that time. There were more lucrative and, in fact, marginally easier jobs to be had working with the railways, and many women did find themselves having to pull up their stakes and leave, which is what Martin's mother did in fairly short order, although it seems that the family stayed at least part of the year on the farm until she was nearly of school age, 4 or 5, which supports the likelihood that the experience of that landscape stayed with her and affected her later work. Her school age years were spent in Vancouver on the British Columbian coast, and they were lively. She loved being by the water. She always would love being by the water, which is a little paradoxical since she spent so much of her life in the desert. But she loved sailing. She loved swimming. In fact, she was a competitive swimmer and got as far as trials for the 1932 Olympics. She didn't make the team, but she is listed in local newspapers for having been part of the trials. By that time, by 1932, she had actually left Canada. She came to Washington State in 1931, finished high school for a second time. Not entirely clear why, although it is fairly certain that she had a perhaps a little bit more than average amount of adolescent misbehavior going on. So she finished high school again and then enrolled in a teacher's college in the Northwest in Washington State, Bellingham, and became a teacher, which was a very common route for independent women. At that time, the early 1930s, difficult for anyone. she sort of launched herself at the height of the Depression, and teaching was certainly a route for women who felt that they needed to support themselves. Her early teaching was in one-room schoolhouses in the Pacific Northwest. So we're still, we still have one foot in the 19th century, pretty primitive teaching circumstances and living. And she took other jobs as well to support herself. At the same time, she was in shooting distance of Seattle, which in the early mid-1930s, later 1930s, was a very lively cultural community. There was a school there called the Cornish School, which brought over artists in every discipline, theater and dance, especially dance, and music, as well as painting and sculpture. John Cage and Merce Cunningham were there at the time that Agnes was living in the Pacific Northwest. Cage was performing at the Cornish School as well as elsewhere in Seattle. Morris Graves was a big presence there. So was Mark Tobey. One thing that's important about the Seattle scene is that all of the artists there had exposure, if not firsthand, secondhand, to the Pacific Rim countries, to Asia, and many of them traveled there, which brought the influences of Zen and Buddhism, Taoism to the West Coast significantly ahead of its impact on the East Coast in New York. So if, which isn't established, Martin was aware of the cultural community in Seattle, she had a chance then to be exposed to work that has a real similarity to hers, the writerly line that can be seen in Tobey's work, the sort of skittish descriptive line that can be seen in Morris Graves's, especially his paintings of birds. All of those can be felt in Martin's work as well. I think even though we don't know for sure that she had the chance to see that advanced work at that time in the 1930s in Seattle, it's unlikely that she would have launched herself across the country to New York to further her education if she hadn't had a chance to be exposed to the most progressive art of her time. And that is indeed what she did in 1941. She set off for New York. Resumed her education. She continued to go to school well into her 30s. So she undertook a second degree in teaching, this time at Teachers College, which is associated with Columbia University in New York. So she was in New York for the year 1941 to 42, a time when lots of European modernists, surrealists in particular, were in New York because of World War II. So again, she had the chance to be exposed to a really extraordinary range of modern painting, although she was also quite busy with her schoolwork and, as always, with supporting herself. One thing about Martin's childhood that becomes important in her later life and work is the issue of discipline, of being a disciplinarian. Martin's relationship with her mother was pretty terrible by her many accounts, although there were things about her mother she admired greatly, one of them being her success at raising a family of 4 children on her own. She did that in Vancouver by renovating and reselling houses, which seems very resourceful indeed. It also suggests at least a minimum amount of design sense, of visual interest, although Martin does not talk about the art education of her early years. But one of the things that Martin did throughout her life was maintain a sense of discipline, and throughout her teaching years, which went on for some time, she identified herself as a very gifted disciplinarian. She said, like her mother, she really didn't have to do much. A raised eyebrow could do the trick. So she seems to have been both very powerfully imposing in her personal presence and very aware of that gift from early on. After her first year at Teachers College, she was on the road again. Itineracy is something that would characterize her life throughout, really. And by the middle 1940s, she was in New Mexico, a place that she discovered to be congenial and that she would return to after her second stint in New York and stay. Could I have the first slide, please? So here is art school in New Mexico in the late 1940s. This is an image of Agnes Martin, very comfortable on a horse, at the fields taking her art supplies to do landscape painting at the Field School, which is connected to the University of New Mexico. By the time she arrived at the University of New Mexico, she was doubling as a teacher as well as enrolling as a student, and they recognized at once that she was really too advanced to be simply enrolled as a student. A lot of the teaching at the Field School was fairly conservative, landscape painting and portrait painting. There's another photograph of Agnes doing plein air landscape painting. And again, Taos was a surprisingly lively community in cultural terms. It had been, since the turn of the century, a magnet for artists in every discipline again. Writers as well as painters. Mabel Dodge, later Mabel Dodge Lewin, moved there in the 30s and supported a very rich sort of cultural community that was directly related to the salon that she had run in New York in Greenwich Village. Among the artists who participated in that community were Marston Hartley. John Marin was there. They followed earlier New York painters John Sloan and Robert Henry. Georgia O'Keeffe was in town, well, not right in Taos, but not far. D.H. Lawrence had been there. It was a place that was already sort of legendary for supporting venturesome artists. Again, in Taos, there was a very broad range of cultural reference, Eastern spiritual systems, as well as Native American art were of great interest to the local artists. Martin's closest friends included Beatrice and Louis Mandelman, who themselves had come from New York and were friends with the more advanced artists of the time. And this is where the first of the known paintings of Agnes Martin were created. This is a self-portrait from the late 1940s. And I think it's possible to see in this painting sort of premonitions of things to come. One can see the stripes and that shirt that's sort of flattening her body as a premonition of her interest in geometry. It's also possible to say that this is a fairly academic exercise undertaken possibly as part of a portfolio production and possibly as something that she undertook for teaching purposes. It's also, of course, very tempting to read into this image the character of the woman making it thoughtful, introverted, and I think notably powerful. This is Martin with a portrait she painted at the same time of a model. There are odd things about some of these early portraits that have to do particularly with the way she handled the eyes, which in this case are painted jet black from rim to rim, lid to lid. There's an early portrait in which the eyes are, rather than being painted, penciled in. So there's already in this early work an interest in both the address of the subject and also the use of pencil, which is something that, of course, would take priority in later work. This is a landscape. It's a very small painting, so of course one of the things that slides do is eliminate a sense of scale. And I think it does give you the sense of the clarity of distant things in the New Mexico landscape. It also gives you a sense of how deeply her work was influenced by those who were around her, John Marin in this case, Paul Klee, I think, in this case, a painting called Bluebird from 1954. The eye of that bluebird is very heavily impastoed. It's possible, I think, without too much of a stretch, to see the earliest examples of gridded structure in this painting. At the same time, she was developing a vocabulary of biomorphic forms influenced by painters like Juan Miro and William Baziotes. Betty Parsons, the New York gallery owner who had seen Martin's work in the middle 1950s when Martin was in Teachers College, she went back to Teachers College twice, once in 1951 and then a second time in 1954. So she didn't complete her second master's degree in teaching with a major in fine arts until she was in her 40s. And Parsons expressed interest in Martin's work at that time in the middle 1950s. Parsons was a frequent visitor to Taos, and she came back in 1957 and told Martin that she would represent her if she made the commitment to live in New York, which was a deal that actually Parsons struck with a number of artists. If you're really serious about your work, show me by moving to New York. You can't continue to hide out here in Taos, where things are perhaps too convivial, and you're not going to be pushed hard enough. And in fact, there's some wisdom to that. Martin's work did change significantly. So in that year, in 1957, Martin was 45. She pulled up stakes again and moved to New York for what turned out to be the only decade, 1957 to 67, that she lived in a major metropolitan center, that she lived in New York. So one remarkable thing about her career is that she achieved this international reputation while living about as far from cosmopolitan art worlds as she could. This is a photo taken on the roof of 21 Coenties Slip. Martin lived for a couple of months with Parsons on 14th Street and then moved down to Coenties Slip, which was, I think, the term often used is now legendary. It has, in fact, become a legendary community of artists. Coenties Slip, the seaport area of Lower Manhattan, is remarkably isolated from the rest of Manhattan, despite, as you can see in this image, the proximity of the financial capital of the world. Wall Street is blocks away. But the commercial activity of the seaport then was the seaport, and its building stock was very old, all 19th century, very tumble down. Joseph Mitchell has written about this area very, very evocatively. It is an area that, again, has attracted artists since the 19th century. Walt Whitman, Herman Melville were writers who lived there and wrote about it. And it afforded a kind of insularity to the artists who came down there, among whom, and these are artists who are in this photograph, were Ellsworth Kelly, Jack Youngerman, that's Jack Youngerman's son Duncan in the middle of the picture, and his wife, Delphine Seyrig. And there's Agnes sort of perched on the ledge, and I like to see in this photograph, Lena Fritsch has written very beautifully about the photographs of that have been taken of Agnes Martin. I like to think of her as sort of the dorm mother she often was. That was one of her disciplinary jobs. So she's a little older, she's a little removed, she's a little sort of, she's got that kind of smile of a certain amount of inner power and a certain amount of social distance, which is, in fact, how the artists who lived down there remembered her. One of the things that characterized the community at Coenties Slip, it also included Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. James Rosenquist lived down there, Robert Indiana, who I've mentioned, all of whom were important to Martin, was that it was a place that was understood to be welcoming to gay men and lesbian women. And in fact, it was understood to be that way in direct contrast to the abstract expressionist scene that was centered around 10th Street, which 10th Street is sort of uptown with relationship to Coenties Slip. Morton Feldman, who is a musician who is friendly with John Cage, Cage was very connected to the scene, talked about Jackson Pollock, a 10th Street abstract expressionist guy, as a raging heterosexual. So there was felt at the time mutual antagonism, and there was also felt at the time the pleasure of being in a community where that antagonism wasn't a daily experience. But the physical characteristics of the harbor are important to Martin's work as well, and her palette, I think, reflects that at the time. So Linda Ortani is another artist who was important to Martin's work. She was a textile artist and was also personally important to Martin. She was one of a couple of women with whom Martin is known to have had romantic relationships during this 10-year period. It's also said that she had romantic relationships with women in New Mexico when she lived there. This is a painting called called Harbor, which is upstairs. And if you haven't seen it, you should see the real thing because it looks nothing like this. It does have the palette of the harbor. It's right next in this exhibition to a painting that was done in Taos. And although the vocabulary is similar, these sort of softened, in this case, softened from geometry. In the case of the Untitled Taos painting, softened from biomorphic forms. The vocabulary, apart from that, is quite similar, except this one does tend toward the colors of, life by a saltwater seaport. The Taos painting is much more deserty, adobe. It's not explicitly that, but it's closer to that. Bricks and salmon colors. Another thing that was characteristic of some of the early work that Martin did when she was at the seaport were these assemblages that made use of detritus that was on hand down there. Boat spikes, in the case of this painting, The Laws, which is here at the Tate, a painting that actually is made even more imposing by the fact that it leans against the wall rather than being hung. She also, at that time, made numbers of paintings where these incipient grids, this is one of the earliest grids, this is a painting called Little Sister from 1962. It's a small painting. So those are teeny little brass brads that she hammered into the canvas as a sort of punctuation, and also, I think, a mark of light, a mark of glitter, which is, I think, a way she used the pencil as well. She used hard graphite as a system of marking that picks up light. It's subtle, and it has to be looked at under raking light to see it, but I think it's implicit in a lot of her work. In any case, she was experimenting with a lot of found objects. She was a ruthless, ruthless editor of her own work, and an awful lot of this premature, pre-signature Agnes Martin work was discarded. She put a mat knife through it. She tossed it into the ditch. She burnt it. So she talks about a painting of this time that involved thousands of nail heads, which we would love to see, but as far as we can know, I discussed this just this afternoon with Frances Morris, those paintings no longer exist. One thing that is a great surprise among many surprises to me of the exhibition here is some of the other assemblages that have been found for this show, including one called Burning Tree, which is just a ferocious little object, which is circular. It looks like a kind of spike-tipped crown. I think of it as sort of a Viking helmet. So it is anomalous as far as we know within her career, but I think one thing it suggests is the complexity of her character. Martin has many, many devoted fans, some of whom most admire in her a sense that has surrounded her work and her character as a kind of sage of the desert, as a sort of queen of serenity. And she did actually practice various forms of meditation. She had incredible internal discipline. She was interested in reaching a state of internal calm. But she was a complicated person, full of ambition, and perfectly capable of the kinds of emotional experiences that are suggested by a work like Burning Tree. During her early years at Coenties Slip, her primary influences were the painters that showed along with her at Betty Parsons' gallery. Parsons was one of the most important, as I said, dealers in introducing and promoting the abstract expressionist painters. She talked about her four giants, the painters with whom she began. That would be Barnett Newman, Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Clifford Still. One by one they left her because Parsons was a notoriously bad businesswoman. Agnes Martin talked about, how at the end of a year of being represented by Betty, she owed Betty money rather than the other way around, because the deal was the artists were responsible for their announcement cards, for their insuring their work, for trucking their work to they were responsible for everything. Not the way business is done these days. And if Betty sold her work, they got a portion of it. So it actually was possible to end the year as an artist represented by Betty Parsons in debt to her. And so one by one, the major artists left. Agnes did herself. She only was represented by Parsons for 3 years. Betty came to call her four giants her four horsemen after they left. Reinhardt remained with her until the end of her life. But the influence, the importance of being introduced by Parsons, the influence of those painters, Mark Rothko certainly in this painting of 1958 called The Spring, remain. And their essential disposition, their belief that painting was about the representation of a state of being, an emotional state, a spiritual state, were aspects that Martin supported in her own work. Another thing that I think is crucial about the development of the work for which she became known was this hand-ruled line, hand-ruled and hand-drawn, that entered her work in the 1960s and stayed with it until the end, almost the very end. It's a line that I like to think of as a line of thought. It runs throughout her work in a way that's, of course, not quite verbal, but in a sense it's structured like writing. It's structured like penmanship. It's structured like language. And in fact, it is much more frequently a horizontal than a vertical line in her work, although many, many critics talk about Martin as a painter of grids. The grids were, that is, grids that involve two axes, were characteristic of her work only for a few years in the middle 1960s. When she resumed painting after a hiatus in the middle 1970s, almost without exception, the paintings were horizontal stripes. There are exceptions. And I was struck by the placement of a drawing called Words from 1961 in the middle of the drawings room in the exhibition here. titles of Martin's work are very tricky. She complained in both early and late that her friends and her colleagues were giving titles to her work. She certainly gave titles to her work as well, although her preference was for work not being titled, that the experience should be what you see, not the words that surround it. And yet I am very tempted to take the fact that she called this drawing words, and it's a drawing with horizontal lines that are interrupted by triangles. Triangles are a motif that showed up early and again at the very end. I don't think it makes sense to think of those triangles as symbols for words, and yet there was an inclination to accept the idea that language was one of the templates against which her work was drawn. And certainly also at the Seaport, when she was there were many artists who were interested in the intersection of language and imagery. They include Jasper Johns, who was making gridded alphabets at that time, Robert Rauschenberg, who was using newsprint, Cy Twombly wasn't at the Seaport, but he was good friends with Rauschenberg and Johns. His work involves these very bold cursive lines, and her friend Robert Indiana, who is developing his sign-based work, all of which involves words as well. Indiana and Martin read Gertrude Stein together. There was an awful lot of reading going on at the Seaport. With Ann Wilson, who was another friend at the Seaport, she read St. Teresa's Lives of the Saints. They were reading various Zen and Buddhist masters. They were reading in Taoism. They were reading Merton. Agnes was very good friends with Ad Reinhardt in this period, and she would have known of Merton and of D.T. Suzuki, who is a key promoter of Buddhism in this country through Reinhardt. And the two women she was involved with most closely during this period, Lenore Tawney and Krissa was a Greek artist who used only one name, were both involved at this time with written language. Tawney, although best known as a textile artist, was also making small collages that involved weavings of strips of found poetry and print. And Krissa was making these both sculptures that were based on books. They were called cycladic books. They were actually made by casting the inside of cardboard boxes and plaster. And also the work she was best known for, these great big neon signs, signs that are based on letter forms. So I think when Martin was undertaking paintings like these, this is White Flower, a sort of classic grid from 1960 to 62. Friendship, this spectacular gold leaf painting, which is upstairs here from 1963. I think of this as sort of the Camelot years painting of Martin's work. It's anomalous. She made a couple of other paintings that involve gold leaf, but this is the only one where the entire field is made of gold leaf, which is very difficult and very fragile. This image shows it before. It must have been restretched, or something before it arrived here, because it has this sort of ripple in this image that it doesn't have upstairs. It's quite a glorious painting. This painting, which does disappear, sadly, in reproduction, called The Tree, is a painting of which Martin was particularly proud. And it is one of her penciled grids. It is a grid. It's a little bit hard to see that there are both vertical and horizontal lines marking the entire field. This is another painting at the Museum of Modern Art. It was acquired in the year of its creation, which is 1964. Excuse me. Martin talked about paintings like this one. She talked quite a bit about this painting. She felt it was important. She talked about their composition in terms of inspiration, which is commonplace among artists, but Martin's notion of inspiration was distinct. When she talked about inspiration, she was talking about a vision that came to her complete and intact, but very small. So that's a 6-foot painting, 6-foot square. All of Martin's mature paintings are 6-foot square, but the inspiration came to her in the size of a postage stamp. So the job was to blow it up, which was more difficult than you might imagine. All of those internal ratios had to be adjusted, and math, I think, was probably not her strong suit. So you see these pages of sort of mad-looking calculations there, the end papers of a book that Martin's dealer, Ernie Glimsher, published a couple of years ago about her, just proliferations of multiplication and division. How am I going to make this work? And here's one of the things she said about inspirations. When I had the inspiration for grids, I was thinking of Innocence, key word for her, and the image was a grid. That was it. I thought, my God, am I supposed to paint that? So, it's sort of, there's something kind of quizzical and odd about that. It's funny, and there's this sense that she's listening to a kind of higher power. And I think it's possible at this juncture to talk about the relationship between the inspirations and visions, and about the relationship between visions and voices. Martin had schizophrenia. She was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in the 60s. She had a couple of serious psychotic breaks during the decade that she was in New York. She was hospitalized a couple of times. She was hospitalized later in her life, too, and treated with talk therapy and medication throughout much of her adult life. Schizophrenia generally affects people earlier on, so it's likely that those were not her first psychotic episodes. She heard voices, and the voices were peremptory. They gave her instructions. They told her what to do. And I think it's possible to think about the line of thought that runs through her work as having a relationship to these voices. This is very tricky territory to enter. I think there is some merit in talking about her work being a way of mediating and regulating the kind of noise that sometimes intruded. I think also she sometimes had an experience of the sensory world as being overwhelming, and I think the effort to control that through the creation of these very carefully ordered works is one of the impetuses behind them. At the same time, I think it's important to respect the fact that her work wasn't a symptom, it wasn't a cure. She was an extremely sophisticated artist, and her work developed in relationship to work going on around her at the time, not through the bidding of her internal voices. In some ways, she was quite frank about the misery of having mental illness, although of course she never named it as such. She never talked about it. It wasn't talked about while she was alive. Neither, for that matter, was the fact of her relationships with women. The solitary life is full of terrors, is one thing she said about the depression that was also part of her illness. Her writing tended to be seen as a kind of sort of statement of serenity, of triumph, of transcendence over difficulty. But her writing is varied, is inconsistent, is full of things that are quite poetic, lyrical, and as well some passages that frankly make no sense at all. For anyone who spent time with her writings, I think that inconsistency becomes apparent. There's a wonderful new biography of Vincent van Gogh, of course, is the sort of poster guy for artists battling mental illness, in which Van Gogh is quoted as saying that his work was a lightning conductor for this illness, which I think is kind of a wonderful way to put it. May give a little bit too much weight to mental illness in relationship to Martin's work. And then the biographer, Julian Bell, describes Van Gogh's late paintings of olive groves as saying, in many passages, the steady stenographic brushstroke applied to these 8-odd large canvases become a zombie facture, unimpeded by thought. I think zombie facture and unimpeded by thought also stretch the case with Martin, and yet it's kind of a useful phrase to think about the way paintings like hers were made, a kind of internalization of a vision that just gets executed because of the impulse that she's representing. In any case, whatever role her illness played in the creation of her work, it did, at the end of the 1960s, have a role in the decision she made to cease making work altogether for a period of time. In 1967, she sold her art-making supplies, and she left New York. She didn't return. And there are a number of explanations for this fairly radical departure. Just when her career was gaining steam, her loft was torn down. That was the reason she most often gave. Her friend Ad Reinhardt died. Her relationship with Chrissa ended. All of these were difficult things. She had also had a fairly serious psychotic break just prior, and I think she felt that the New York art world, which was really heating up at that time, especially in market terms and in publicity, was not a place she wanted to live the rest of her life. So she moved back to New Mexico, and that's where she stayed. She lived first on a mesa top in Cuba, which makes this look like a kind of major metropolis. And then she moved down to Galisteo, which is where this photograph was taken. She wandered around for 18 months without settling in any place at all around the Pacific Northwest and the American West. And she spent a lot of that time, indeed, under radically solitary circumstances. But she also went to Big Sur. She went to Las Vegas. Nortani traveled with her. Lots of contradictions. This is a picture of Agnes Martin at that time. This is the middle 1970s. Before she resumed painting, there was no painting between 1967 and the early 1970s. She tried a number of other things. She made a couple of films. She made the film Gabriel, which follows this boy through this quite spectacularly beautiful countryside, filmed in the Northwest and in California as well as New Mexico. She also made a film called Captivity, which wound up in the dumpster, which was as different from Gabriel, which is a very quiet, slow-moving film, as a film could be. Captivity was a historical costume drama about Genghis Khan, who had captured a Chinese princess and held her for ransom. The idea was if he had the princess, he wouldn't attack China. Agnes said that she went to Japan to hire actors for this film, but she wasn't happy because in Japanese theater, she was interested in traditional No theater. All the women were men, and so she came back to San Francisco and found much more to her liking that in the San Francisco No theater community, or so she said, all the men were women. That worked better for her. The cost, at this point, she had begun to show her work through Pace Gallery. She was making more money. She was able to buy an expensive camera. The production costs must have been considerable, and the demands of the production must also have been considerable. And in any case, she wound up being dissatisfied with the whole experiment and tossed it. Another act of destruction we wish she hadn't carried out. She designed an earthwork at this time. It was meant to be a walled garden, and she would let one visitor in at a time and gauge their response. She decided it wasn't necessary to build it because she could picture it. She knew what it was going to be like. And this was New Mexico, where what it walled in would be, mainly gravel. It wasn't to be a garden with things blooming like these daisies. she also began to write in earnest and to publish her writing at this time. And in 1973, she had a retrospective at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, which, along with representation by Pace, really helped put her work on the map and introduced it to an even larger public. She wasn't without a public at that time. But from the middle 1970s forward, she lived in much greater comfort, although her residence were always Spartan. She gave absolutely no concern to the way she lived, to what she wore. People do love to tell stories about what she looked like when she showed up to give a talk, and it was without concern for style whatsoever. I recently heard from Chuck Close that she gave a talk at Harvard, and Louise Nevelson was in the audience, and Louise Nevelson urged Agnes to let her make up her face and put Louise Nevelson's famous eyelashes on her, and Agnes agreed. I find this hard to believe. But what is believable is that she would, sort of put up her hands and say, fine, that's of no concern to me. From this period forward, when her life became more stable, and her work also was emptied of elements that she considered extraneous. So that would be the kinds of details that she introduced to her painting in the 50s and 60s. Most of these paintings are horizontal stripes. The variations, one of the analogies she liked best for visual art is music. The response that she wanted was the kind of response that people give to music, a sensitivity to the rhythms of the painting, to the to the coloration of the painting, to the emotional tones that it strikes. That small drawing is from 1977. This is one of the many paintings that she made in shades of gray and black throughout these later decades. This is from 1977. Many of these involve washes of India ink as well as paint. And she didn't think of these necessarily as melancholy paintings. It's not like the colored paintings were the happy ones and the gray paintings were the sad ones. One of the grayscale paintings upstairs is called Fiesta, and I think it is a celebratory painting. It's impossible to look at these works and not see atmosphere, not see the color of the sky, the color of the landscape in New Mexico, and the delicacy that she was able to register. This is a series of paintings that are installed in the Harwood Museum in Taos, a gift to the Harwood. And 1994, she did a handful of series of paintings, but I think it's important that even in the works done in series, you really need to experience each one individually. Looking at them like this gives you the false impression that they're meant to be read in sequence. They do have family relationships, but it's the individual relationship with each of them that I think delivers what she put into them. In the last decade of her life, she mixed things up again and introduced shapes, bounded shapes, forms of asymmetry, colors that she hadn't worked with in a very long time. From the 1970s forward until the late 90s, basically she worked with primaries. It was very dilute red, very dilute blue, very dilute yellow sometimes. When people describe her work, paintings that some people might see as yellow are called white, or as blue are called white. There are shades of white that drift toward yellow and toward blue at either end that characterize her so-called white paintings. But of course, it's unmistakable that in this painting she's got that dramatic royal blue slash across the top and these bouncing squares. And it's hard not to see her sort of, on the one hand, both entertaining risk, and on the other hand, contemplating the circle of her career, the circle of life, speculating about what was in store for her next. She did believe in reincarnation. this is the very last drawing that she made, and it's known as such, the last drawing. And I think, it's, I think, universally sort of touching. It's a very poignant drawing, quite beautiful. And as far as I can tell, made of 2 strokes of ink. It's about this big, a couple of inches on the side. One of the things that is so poignant about it is that you see in it all of the effort it took her to repress the response to nature that she wanted to achieve in order to create these paintings that were based on non-objective emotional states. But the response to what she saw, and the response in particular to examples of natural beauty, was one of the engines that powered her work from the beginning to the end. And in this last painting, she allowed it to come forward. So if you will indulge me, I am going to read from the last 3 pages of my book, and then I will take questions. I called the introduction to this book Abstraction, and the final chapter Composure, a bit of shameless wordplay, to suggest that 2 states with which Agnes struggled. And composure goes like this. Almost all artists, I think, sometimes feel that their integrity and credibility rest on beliefs that are frail as a spider web. This may be particularly true of abstractionists. Martin spoke over and over of doubt, of accepting it and using its lessons to move forward. I want particularly to talk to those who recognize all of their failures and feel inadequate and defeated. And to those who feel insufficient, short of what is expected or needed, she said. I would like somehow to explain that these feelings are the natural state of mind of the artist, that a sense of disappointment and defeat is the essential state of mind for creative work. She also wrote, quote, helplessness, when fear and dread have run their course. In the face of such helplessness and failure, the resolution she sought might best be called composure. It is a quality recognized equally in the arrangement of lines and colors on canvas, that is, in composition, of tone and measure in music, again composition, and of heart and mind in human experience. Martin believed that all living things share the capacity for such harmony. The lines she drew mapped a transit of power that fuels happiness, beauty, and innocence, and danger as well. In seeking to express the vibrancy and joy inherent to animate beings, she also strove to regulate an energy that was not always easy to tame. Sometimes she was unable to control these currents, and they overwhelmed her. Sometimes they fizzled and went dead. Such struggle may be common among artists, but Martin waged it with special vigor. The sense of doubt of which Martin so often spoke can threaten viewers as well. Lawrence Alloy strikes a plaintive note in his 1966 essay Systemic Painting when he writes, quote, what is missing from the formalist approach to painting is a serious desire to study meanings beyond the purely visual configuration, close quote. He is impatient with writers who find emotional expression in the work, noting dryly, this sometimes I'm happy, sometimes I'm blue interpretation is less than one hopes for. Yet Alloway's solution to look at fixed formal systems as distinctive fingerprints of artists' intentions doesn't take us much further. Similarly, William Seitz, after hailing the advent of a brand new art form based on enlisting perceptions that take place between cornea and brain, wondered in print, can such works that refer to nothing outside themselves replace with psychic effectiveness the content that has been abandoned? Such questions and quibbles are probably inevitable. Our position as viewers can hardly be more secure than that of artists. And no ardent admirer of abstract painting can avoid moments when, for whatever reason, the current of energy breaks. Martin's The Tree, that was on the screen a while ago, in the Museum of Modern Art, New York, was the first of her paintings I encountered. I was a teenager, and it has stayed with me ever since. Returning to it when I began writing this book, I found it static and coldly white. It was a dismaying moment. I sat on a bench with pad and pen in hand and saw nothing but pencil lines and paint. Was it the lighting? A recent cleaning? Did the tree have bad company on the walls that day? Or a more selfish thought in the gallery with its noisy throngs of careless viewers? Martin believed firmly that her work was dependent on the observer's response, and I was failing it. And to Martin, it was no minor painting. Describing it when it was acquired by MoMA the year after it was completed, she said, "When I first made a grid, I happened to be thinking of the innocence of trees, and then this grid came into my mind, and I thought it represented innocence, and I still do. And so I painted it, and then I was satisfied. I thought, this is my vision." On a subsequent viewing, the tree came back to life for me. It was again an image of nature, sublimated into the radiance of geometry. Like the majestic pump that a big tree is, sucking water from the earth and moving it towards sunlight, the painting once more seemed to breathe visibly with its biaxial double stroke of inspiration and exhalation. A painting can create an updraft and take you with it. It can also be a buffer for the kind of shattering, screaming beauty that may swallow you whole, as I believe Martin often felt her sensorium threaten to do. The business of response is a delicate-willed operation, a deep but unstable joy even when it succeeds. The relationship between an artist and a writer, or an artist and a viewer, is complicated. In her letter to me, Martin implored, "Write your true response instead of stirring around in knowledge or quoting responses made by others, the past, and your thesis will be effective because it will be the truth. Only the truth is effective. All ideas are false. They are conjecture. False because by the time you have them, they are the past, and false besides!" Exclamation point. Close quote. Although I've tried to honor the spirit of her advice, I haven't been entirely faithful to her injunction. And naturally, she too was full of ideas, produced and acquired by her singularly complicated and hungry mind. If it is not easy to assemble a cohesive, comprehensive story of Martin's life, neither is it simple to explain why it should matter. She herself was perfectly clear that biography is meaningless. Quote, "Almost everyone believes that art is from the experience of the artist, meaning the intellectually grasped experience. They believe that it is affected by where you live and what you do. But one's biography, character, abilities, knowledge, all of that has nothing to do with artwork. Inspiration is the beginning, the middle, and the end." She went further. I want to repeat. There are no valid thoughts about art. If your sensibilities are awake, you will respond. It will be a pleasant experience, recalling happy times. You must see that no talking will help, and that no defense is necessary, and that you must not answer your critics. But most of all, you must have no contact with them. This can give a critic and a biographer pause. Indeed, there are no lurking symbolic images in her paintings begging for interpretation in light of her varied life experiences. Visual art by its nature does not reduce to words. But I believe that insofar as words are a part of the current of her thought, they hum along the lines of her paintings. More than anything else, Martin's work brings her particular spirit into clearer focus. The work is, of course, also the reason we care to make that spirit's acquaintance, and it is our invitation. Incomplete as she insisted without us, the paintings are the extension of a hand, an opening to an understanding, and the expression of an optimistic conviction that such an understanding, as intimate and powerfully transformative as it is personal, can be achieved. Thank you. So I will gladly take questions. I've been told to ask that you wait for the microphone. It's roving. Yeah, Roger.
I just wanted to ask you what you thought of the very late the trapezoid painting. I've forgotten what it's called now. It's got an
Homage to Life.
Homage to Life. and the painting with the triangles. Because somehow I'm sort of, I mean, I love her work, but those paintings don't really do it for me. And I don't know whether it's just that I expect, I feel disappointed that she suddenly made these paintings, although I can see the connection that the exhibition makes to her earlier works. It sort of makes this thing round. But I just wondered what you critically thought of those works, whether you feel the same sort of slight disappointment that I feel.
Honestly, I don't.
I don't know.
Although I do think that the response to her work is very personal, and she was, Arnie Glimcher talks about her being as good an editor as she was a painter. That she was excellent at knowing which ones weren't working and which ones were keepers, and it's possible that she became more lenient at the end. But particularly Homage to Life succeeds for me. I think the mystery of that, the first time I saw it, I thought, oh my God, it's a New Mexican mesa. And then I thought, no, shame on you, she doesn't paint landscape. There is a sense of, to me, of the color of night, and also, and here too I'm on very shaky ground, some reckoning with mortality in the very dark, dark black shapes that come into, including the one with the two, I think of those as oddly, joyful bouncing squares of, deepest, most macabre blackness. So I think she gave herself some liberties in those last works.
And is it right that trapezoid painting was actually painted by somebody else?
Not as far as I know. I was present at a symposium where there was discussion of another painting that was said to have been painted by someone else. Stories circulate, and one thing I've learned as a beginning biographer is that there is no such thing as history. So if you hear one story and you ask for confirmation of it from a second party, you get a different story, and the third party will give you a third. So.
The other thing is that extraordinary last drawing that she made, which is so incredibly beautiful and mysterious, and it's very difficult to know how to interpret it, really.
It is, I agree. And, the way it speaks is sort of dangerously close to a kind of sentiment that she's so studiously avoided.
Yeah.
And yet, there it is.
But actually, it's the touch, it's the hand, in a way, and the scale of it, which makes it so moving. And anyway, that's really what I had to say.
Thank you for that question.
Hi. I know you touched on it a bit about spirituality stemming from Eastern art. How far do you think that influenced her work?
I think reckoning with spiritual power was something that was very, very deep in her. I don't think there were particular spiritual practices that she adhered to in any orthodox way. She was raised by Presbyterians, Scotch Presbyterians, Calvinist, and I do believe that the discipline, the self-denial of religious practice was something that was important to her and that she sought. It was an effort. And I think the discipline is the humility that she sought, and I think she felt it was a struggle. She was always writing about the sin of pride, of struggling against pride. So the humility and the discipline that she sought are offered by religious practice. And she certainly listened to, read, to some extent, about a really wide range, including the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, and various Buddhist and Taoist masters.
we are so in awe of her access to spiritual dimensions or whatever, but you at one point made mention to her being full of ambition, and I wondered to what extent did she shape her career?
Did she shape her career? Actively. I mean, I think...
And what does that mean?
Well, her choice to leave Betty Parsons, and Betty Parsons was so, was so key to her emergence as an artist, and they remained very close. It has been said that she had a romantic relationship with Parsons as well. Jack Tilton talks about, the Agnes Martin path on, Betty Parsons' house at the beach. So walking away from her took some courage. And, Martin described it as being one of the hardest things she ever did. But she knew she had to walk away, and so she did. And I do think that, there are choices that she made that were odd. Her choice of opposing almost all publications during her lifetime probably cost her. But her career, thrived nonetheless, and that is no mean achievement for somebody dealing with a serious mental illness. So,
But how was she actively, after Betty Parsons, how did she play an active role in that, given all those circumstances?
By the time she said yes, by her cooperation with Arnie Glimcher, by the many people she accepted, people sort of invited themselves to her various homes in New Mexico, and she courted that. Just as, although she said you must have no contact with critics, of course she spoke to critics as well. I think her editing of her work can also be called a kind of shaping of her career. She was very, very careful to withdraw work that she didn't feel was her strongest, and to get hold of work from early in her career that she wanted to suppress. Is there some other aspect of shaping a career that I'm missing? Thank you.
Is there any either evidence or examples of work she collected of other, not necessarily other artists' work, or what did she surround herself with visually?
It's a good question. Not much. There are sort of conflicting accounts of how supportive she was of younger artists. She was certainly paying attention all along to artists who were younger than she was, of the minimalist generation and on, although I think at a certain point she became less involved in the contemporary art world. But there may be others in the audience who can speak to this also. In terms of what she had on the walls, not much. She sometimes had Native American textiles. She had commercial prints. She had nothing. She liked her furnishings to be spare.
She also had Canadian yarn on the wall.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Did you find it at all conflicting undertaking this project, considering how private she was about her life and trying to kind of separate that from her art?
Yes. Yeah, it was hard. As I said, this is the first biography I've written, and I wouldn't undertake a biography again without knowing I had full access to a substantial archive to the papers, which are not known to exist as such. There are probably, collections of letters and documents that haven't been made available to the public, but I did speak to more than a few people who said yes, and then on second thought, no, I'm sorry, she swore me to secrecy. So even after she was gone.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say something about her. She's a very radical painter. She's a very radical artist. But I read just a bit before I came where the bit you talk about her repudiation of feminism and also, in a way, her repudiation of sexual liberation. I mean, in the sense that she didn't identify with, although she had lesbian friends who were activists, like Jill Johnston, who was a very big lesbian activist in New York. She, and I don't know why, but I find that kind of amusing in a way. It's amusing because she refused the trap of being pinned down. And I mean, I think this has been a problem for a lot of women artists who don't want to identify with a feminist position, really. And yet, I think today, you know, for myself, as you know, as a gay man, I identify with her as a same-sex artist. I think she's a radical same-sex artist. And for me, it's really important. Her lesbianism is really important to me. And I'm sure it must be very important for lots of other same-sex sexes. And I'm sure that she's very important for women, you know, as a woman artist. So there's that sort of paradox, in a way, around all that.
Paradox is definitely the word. You know, her politics in general tended to be rather conservative. But another thing, and she did adamantly resist being identified as a feminist, as a woman, certainly as a lesbian. And yet, yes, she had a very warm, ongoing relationship with Jill Johnston, who was nothing if not outspoken and funny and, you know, just a terrific, insightful writer. So I think here again, one thing that may be pertinent is that she was a different person with every person she was in contact with, which is true of all of us, but I think especially true of someone with schizophrenia, that the relationships she established were bounded, were subject to abrupt termination, and that she didn't really hold consistent views about anything but making her work. That was her field of vision, as I see it.
I mean, would you say, I mean, I think the essay on her by Jill Johnston is absolutely wonderful.
It is.
Actually. I mean, I would recommend anybody who hasn't read that essay. It's probably quite difficult to find, but it's somehow a wonderful essay. It's full of revelations,
Mm-hmm.
and so I don't know. I mean, I think in her own way she was a radical individual as well. She was a radical human being. I mean, and her life actually, not only her activity as a painter, but her life struggles are really exemplary for anybody.
She was brave. Okay. Thank you very much.